This poor Halloween quilt has been waiting over a year to get its binding on. I got it machine quilted and even got it trimmed before I folded it up and set it aside because Halloween had already passed. But Halloween is coming up again in just a couple weeks, and I would like to get this quilt done. So today I'm going to show you all of my binding shortcuts to get a quilt binding on your quilt and ready to stitch really quickly. The first thing we need to do is calculate how many binding strips we need to finish our quilt. I have already measured my quilt, and it measures 40 inches by 46 inches. This is just a little tiny guy. So to calculate how many strips, we add all of the sides up. That gives us 172. Now that's the total perimeter of the quilt, and we need to turn that into strips of fabric. So we're going to take 172 and divide it by the width of our fabric. I like to be a little conservative here. You can use 42 if you're using like a solid. A Kona is usually 42, but some fabrics are a little skinnier and I like to err on the side of giving myself a little bit extra. So I divide by 40, but if you want to measure your fabric and be sure, then you certainly can. That gives us 4.3. Now with binding strips, you always have to round up. Even if this was 4.05, you have to round all the way up to 5. So I have about a 1 yard cut of this striped fabric that I'm going to use today. I really recommend using a yardage cut of fabric rather than piecing together scraps or working with fat quarters. Piecing together all those little pieces is going to take time, and if you're looking for a speedy solution, then use yardage. It will just go so much faster. You'll have fewer seams to sew, and it will also help with our first super cheaty solution. We are going to rip this fabric. I know, a lot of people really dislike ripping fabric, but it is going to give you accurate, skinny strips of fabric to make into your binding. And if you have a small space to work in, like this cutting table where you can't quite cut a hole with the fabric flat, then it's going to be really fast. To get started, I'm going to take my ruler, and I'm starting with the selvage edge here. And that's where we're going to start to rip. The first thing I need to do is get a straight ripped edge. Now, this has been cut with a rotary cutter off the bolt like a normal fabric would, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was cut on grain. And if you can see here, these little threads coming off of here, that's a definite sign that this was not cut on grain. There should be ideally one continuous thread from side to side, and that's what we're going for. If we rip the fabric, it's going to follow right between two threads of your fabric, so you're going to get a really nice straight piece of fabric. So I'm not measuring here, but I do want to rip off the least amount possible. So I'm going to start by cutting in maybe just 1/4 inch or so. I'm making a tiny little slice, just enough to get a rip going, give me something to hold on to, and then I'm going to rip. I know, it's a terrible sound, isn't it? Okay, so I got a continuous strip all the way across my width of fabric, so I'm good to go. If while you were ripping, it kind of petered out and you didn't get to rip all the way from selvage to selvage, then just clip in another 1/3 inch or so and make another tear. As soon as you can tear from selvage to selvage, the entire width of the fabric, then you're ready to go. So now it is time to prep all the strips across. You can do these one at a time. I'm going to make several slits and rip all of my strips at once. So I'm just aligning my ruler with our nice straight grain ripped edge, and then I'm measuring over and just making that same clip into the fabric every 2.5 inches. That's enough for my entire quilt. If I needed more strips, I could either place my ruler here and keep clipping, or just rip all these and then continue that process. But 5 is all I need, so 5 is all I'm going to make. So now it is time to actually rip these strips. So I'm just going to get a nice good grip and have that nice first slice right between my fingers and rip. If you come into a little bit of trouble when you get to the other selvage edge, you can clip through that. Selvages are woven just a little tighter than the field of the fabric, so they might be a little tough to rip through. And if you run into problems, you can always clip through that selvage edge. Now it is time to join our ends. There's really no way around this task. You can do a straight butt joint if you would prefer. I like to do that nice 45-degree angle so that the bulk of the seam is spread out a little bit on the binding of my quilt. So I'm just going to overlap my edges and sew corner to corner for all of these strips. So now I have one long strip of binding strips, and we are going to tackle our next shortcut, which is that we are not going to press this in half. We are going to sew it on just by folding it. Now, because we took the time to rip our strips and get them really nicely on grain, there is not a lot of stretch to this fabric. I mean, there's a little, like if I pull really hard, I can see a stretch. But if you've ever worked with a bias cut fabric or jelly roll strips that aren't cut quite on grain, you know that there can be quite a lot of stretch to fabric. But there's no incomplete threads along the edges of these strips because we tore and that followed between two threads. So we have really nice, complete, stable strips here. And that's going to make it a lot easier to fold these strips in half and keep them nice and aligned as we stitch them down to our quilt. You have a choice to make at this point, whether you are going to sew your binding to the front of your quilt and flip it around to the back to stitch it down, or if you are going to stitch it to the back of your quilt and flip it around to the front to stitch it down. Either way, it goes on exactly the same. It's totally a personal preference. Most hand stitchers stitch to the front of the quilt and stitch down to the back. I know a lot of machine stitchers do the opposite. I'm actually going to mix it up. I am going to machine stitch to the back, flip to the front, and then use a fun decorative stitch on my binding so that it shows on the front. I'm going to start just in the center of a row. It doesn't matter terribly much where you start as long as you're not starting right at a corner. So I'm going to take my strips here. I have them off to the side so that they're out of my way while I'm working. And I'm going to fold this in half, wrong sides together. I'm going to give myself a nice 10 inches or so before I start stitching so that I have this nice long tail so that when I come back around, I can deal with that. I want to make sure to give myself enough room there. You can use a walking foot if you like. I know a lot of people do, but this one is already on my machine, so that's what I'm using. I'm just aligning the edges of about a hand width of this binding, and then I'm going to sew it. I'm going to take a couple of back stitches right at the front because when we come back around to join these edges, there will be a little bit of tension that we're putting on those stitches, so I like to back stitch just a little bit. Once I reach the end of where I have folded, then I take the next chunk of it, fold it, align the edges, and then align that to the quilt. And that's how I'm going to work my way around this quilt. When I get close to a corner, I'm going to sew until I'm about 1/4 of an inch away from the corner of the quilt and take a couple of back stitches and cut my thread. Now we need to turn the corner of our binding, and we're going to do that just as we normally would with ironed strips. We're going to fold away. And what I'm looking for is that edge of the quilt and then the binding to be nice and flat and continuous. And then I'm going to put my fingers right here at the corner and fold it back. And this takes a couple of times of practice just to kind of get your fingers all in the right places so that you end up with a nice little folded corner here. You'll have this flap sticking up, and that is what gives you enough fabric to turn that corner, to fold that binding over to the front or the back, depending on which way you've opted for. I just stuck a pin in there to hold it while I rotated my quilt, and now I am going to align these edges and work my way down the second side. So I'm coming up to my first join, and I haven't even trimmed all the extras off. So I'm just going to do that as I come to them. Cut the extras off, and then I am just going to finger press this open. And fold it, align those edges, and continue sewing. So I have sewn my binding down all the way around my quilt, and we're back almost to where we began. So I have this gap here of about 8 inches or so, and now we need to deal with these ends that we have left in our binding and turn this into a seamless binding, or at least how it'll look like a seamless binding, because we're not going to sew these edges together. Normally, you would overlap these and cut them and awkwardly sew them together and hope it lands flat, but we're going to take an easier approach here. This is the end that I started with, and I'm just going to tuck that out of the way for just a minute. And this is the end that I just finished sewing. I am going to open this up a little bit. And you can't open it up all the way because it is sewn down, folded right here. But I'm just going to lay that top back a little bit and lay this back side, the part that is right sides together with the quilt, down. And I'm just going to pin a little bit of it so that it doesn't move around at all. And now I'm going to pick a place somewhere in the middle of my gap and take this and do a 45-degree fold right off the quilt. And just like that. So that my binding is coming straight off the quilt. And I'm going to move one of my pins and put it through that fold. Now we're going to sew just this back half down. I can't start totally back where I began because of this fold. So I'm going to start about 1.5 inches down, and we're just going to sew this back half of this binding down. I'm being careful to not catch my other side of the fold of this binding. And now we can cut off this excess. It doesn't have to be perfectly flush. We can trim it really nice and flush later, but you just want to get all this out of your way. So now we have this first end to deal with. This is where we started attaching our binding, and it has this nice selvage edge on it. If you want to, or you can, then you are certainly welcome to leave this on. I do it all the time. It's a nice secure edge. It's not going to unravel. So I leave it on if I can. But if you don't want to, or like mine, it's a little bit too long, then you're going to need to trim it down. So we don't want to trim it too short or these edges won't overlap. So if you look at what we did here, we sewed down the back half of our binding strip and we've created this pocket. Eventually, we're going to sew down the other half of this. But for right now, it is this nice pocket that we can put things in, like the edge of a binding strip. But this side is shorter than this side because it's on that diagonal. So we want to make sure when we trim this initial piece, we're trimming it longer than this short side. So you can just lay this on top of here and trim it at least 1 inch or 2 beyond it. You want to make sure that there's plenty of room for this to be nice and secure inside that pocket. It can be anywhere from right here all the way to where your stitching stops. Anywhere in here, you can just trim it. Don't put too much thought into it. So now I am going to fold this in, tuck it inside of that binding pocket, pull this fold back down, and now we're nice and aligned on our edge. I'm just aligning all 4 of those binding edges. They're overlapped from here to here. This is that diagonal part where we folded it down. So now that all 4 of these edges are nice and aligned to the quilt, I'm going to just make sure that they're nice and tight so we don't get any nice folds in our binding. And now I am going to stitch from this point to where we began. And I am going to stick a couple of pins in here just to hold everything secure, since we are going to be stitching through quite a few layers and we don't want them to shift. I'm going to overlap my stitching just a little bit and take a couple of little back stitches. This is where we have overlapped our binding ends. And now we're back onto the first half of the first port of the binding. And I'm going to overlap and take a couple of back stitches. Now there is a bit of a pocket here. These ends are not sewn together, so there is going to be a little bit of an opening there. And right now it looks bigger than it really will be once the quilt is finished. Because remember, we're going to fold this over and then we're going to fold it over again and stitch it down. So that pocket is only going to be the width of your binding, 1/4 inch or so. But by the time we're done with it and you see it from a ways away, it doesn't look any different than this join where there's 2 pieces stitched together. So 2 joins right next to each other, one sewn and one overlapped. Now you can fold your binding over to the other side of the quilt and machine stitch it down if that's your preference, or you can hand stitch it, which is what I'm going to do. Until next time, happy quilting.